friends are synths.
Anytime anybody on an online music forum wants to talk about a new piece of hardware that they're thinking about buying, some smart arse will come along and tell them that they shouldn't be wasting all of their money on buying analog synthesizers or rack mount effects or anything like that, because all they really need to do is download a copy of Ableton or Renoise, get a few VSTs, and somehow they too will be able to be fucking Calvin Harris or something like that. Now there might be some truth to this, right? Because computers are incredibly powerful and people have made entire careers out of, making music on their laptop. However, the truth of the matter is, I am sure everybody knows deep in their hearts that making music on a laptop is just pish. It is not fun in any way. It is not satisfying. And if you think that you enjoy making music on a laptop alone, then I'm sorry to break it to you, but you're lying to yourself. Now, I'm not saying that computers are all bad. I love computers. I spend my life on computers. I actually use computers when it comes to music production fairly regularly. I use Logic as my main DAW, and that's where I mix and kind of put everything together for basically all of my tracks. I use the Arturia effects suite and also some of their really cool VSTs, but they are not necessarily a joy to use on their own. At least for me, I feel like I need that tactility when I'm creating something in order to kind of get into the zone. And one thing that I hate in particular is having to find a wee tiny knob on a recreation of a classic analog synthesizer and spend ages clicking at it with my mouse to fucking get it to turn to the exact point that I want to. Now I get the idea that when you recreate a a synthesizer, you want it to look good and so you make it look like the synth, but there's nothing natural about turning a knob with a mouse. And so for that reason, I am always interested and on the lookout for different MIDI controllers or different interfaces that will let me engage with the software that I have to or want to use in a different kind of more meaningful and expressive manner. To that end, a few months ago, I came across a company called Intech Studio who had brought out these fairly interesting looking MIDI controllers, and I sent them an email and said, "Hi, I'm Stephen from All My Friends Are Synths. Would you mind sending me out some of your controllers so I can test them out?" And for whatever reason, they decided that they were going to send me some, and so for the past few months I have actually been using their Grid controllers. Now I do feel a wee bit bad here because it's taken me a bit of time to do this video, so I apologise to Intech for that. However, I really wanted to spend a bit of time using these things before I did a video to do them justice, so that I wasn't just saying, oh yeah, they seem pretty good, like every other fucking prick on YouTube, a first impressions video of something that they haven't actually ever even used. So I have been using them, and I have to say that I really quite like them, and so I'm doing a genuine video telling you about what they are. Effectively, Grid is a modular MIDI controller setup from Intech Studio, which gives you different options in terms of the types of controls that you want. Now, the idea is that you buy the different modules, and this lets you effectively make up a custom MIDI controller with, parameters or the controls that will suit your, individual situation. There's something like 5 or 6 different modules available at the moment, and one of their biggest selling points is the fact that you can connect them up together in any kind of configuration you see fit through the use of magnetic sides. Now the magnets and their physicality is one thing, however the connection there is more than surface deep in the sense that it doesn't just allow them to sit nicely together, but it also allows them to share data and power between the different modules. Now I've only got 4 of these modules, so I can't actually test the claim on the website, but apparently you can power up to 12 of these Grid modules from a single USB-C cable, and that's awesome because it means you don't have to do that whole thing of connecting everything up with different cables and all that kind of faff. They just work really nicely together, and I have to say that in practice it's very pleasing indeed. When it comes to the modules themselves, you can see here that they're incredibly compact and also very lightweight. I think they come in at something like 175 grams per module or so, I'm told. But in practice, they don't feel cheap at all. They've got a nice aluminium panel and hard plastic sides, and they feel reassuringly well built. They're also not cramped in use, which is really important when you're talking about a physical kind of interface like this. All of the buttons are reassuringly clicky, and all of the knobs and faders and stuff feel as good as you would expect them to. Depending on the module, you might have things like LEDs to indicate the function, which you can customize, and there's also a button on the front of various modules which allows you to cycle between different pages, so you can effectively have 4 different pages of configurations on each module. One thing you note is that whilst these do feel really solid, they aren't necessarily built to be abused in the same way that DJ equipment tends to be, so if that's the kind of thing you're looking for, these these might not suit the bill, but if you're going to use them as a kind of normal person would, then they'll be perfectly fine. Now, the physical modularity of these grids is no doubt impressive. However, the most striking thing for me actually has been the extent to which you can customize them from within the grid editor software. Now, you download and run this on your Mac or on Windows or on Linux, which is kind of impressive in of itself. However, within the editor, you can then basically program any of the buttons or switches or faders or whatever to do almost anything using the Lua scripting language, which is what Monom's Norns and things run on. And that opens up a huge amount of possibilities which aren't necessarily available on many other MIDI controllers at all. Now, this might seem kind of trite and like a fairly obvious thing that MIDI controllers should be editable, and you're right. However, some of my favourite MIDI controllers, like the DJ Tech Tools MIDIFighter and the Twister 3D or whatever it's called, only allow you to change certain parameters, and actually many of the buttons, for example, on the MIDIFighter are set to a particular MIDI note. So if you wanted to change one of the arcade buttons to send out a different MIDI note, you're kind of stuffed. And I've always thought that was such a bizarre design choice because it really limits the ways in which these things can be useful. And that is not a problem at all with these grids. You can literally program them to do whatever you want them to do, and the possibilities are kind of intimidating, actually. This is one area which I think there could be room for improvement, because even though the app is really powerful and I actually really like the design of it, it isn't always necessarily immediately obvious, at least to me, how you make really basic or simple changes, like, you know, switching out the MIDI note that is triggered when you press this button, for example. And to that end, I think there could be maybe an easy mode and an advanced mode of the editor, which would allow kind of beginners to really quickly get in and change those kind of common parameters without, you know, having to dive into all of the bits and pieces and machinations of everything. This isn't necessarily a criticism, it's just perhaps a request from an idiot to make my life a wee bit easier. Now, in terms of ways that you can use these things, obviously with MIDI controllers there's kind of an endless amount of possibilities, but I'm going to kind of run through some of the things that I have been commonly using these for over the past couple of months to give you an idea into the kind of practical reality and see if some of that might match up to your own situations. One of the most obvious ways that you can use MIDI controllers in general would be to control different parameters of your VSTs. So for example, if you've got, I don't know, Arturia's CS80 playing beautiful Vangelis notes and you want to have quicker access to the filter, frequency and cutoff and resonance and all that kind of thing, you could simply plug this into your computer, map those to the different encoders here. This is an endless encoder version of the grid called EN16, and then you'd be able to just control it using that. Now, the thing about this one in particular, which is really nice, is that not only does it have these encoders, but also it's got a secondary function which you can access by pressing them down. And this is something I use all the time as a reset. So for example, if you're mucking about live with the filter frequency cutoff and you want to reset it back to 0, then you can set that to the secondary press here, which is brilliant. As I mentioned earlier, you don't need a computer to use these grid controllers, and in actual fact, you can make use of them to break out the possibilities of your different hardware setups. For example, the Akai Force is something that a lot of people who don't want to use computers will use for music production, as it's a kind of standalone, all-in-the-box thing. However, you might want to break out some of the features of your effects or your synthesizers in there, and again, this thing allows you to do that. You just plug this into your Akai Force, map the different parameters, and away you go. With this and a variety of other situations, the portability of these controllers really comes into its own, because these really don't weigh or take up much room at all, and so you can kind of chuck it in along with your live setup and it's not going to cause you a major headache like schlepping along some other massive MIDI controller. And so you can start to think of the possibilities there. For example, using this in line with smaller setups like the Monom Norns, so you can plug this directly into your Norns and get access to all of those parameters that are in all of the weird and wonderful apps, like, I know, controlling the speed of the falling of the leaves or whatever the fuck it might be in that particular case. One of the One of the ways that I have been using these in particular has been along with my Dirty Wave M8, because it's almost as if these have been created and designed to go perfectly along with the M8. If you're not familiar with the M8, it is a kind of handheld musical tracker device. I've done some videos on the M8 before, you can go watch them, including one with me using it with different MIDI controllers, but this seems to fit it almost like they're cousins, in the sense that it's the same size, it's the same kind of colour scheme, and it just merges so nicely together that having the M8 in this is like having a full music studio that I can just put in my backpack and go play a full gig on, which is excellent. Of course, one caveat is that if you want to use these grids with devices where you can't just plug in USB to USB, then you're going to have to get some kind of USB MIDI host. And there's a variety of different ones available. There's one from RetroKits, which I've talked about before, which is called the RK006. Intech Studio have also come up with their own solution, which currently I think is in pre-order for something like $99, going up to $119 later. And it's a brilliant companion to these, which lets you plug in your grids into that and then use them with traditional hardware MIDI setups, which is excellent. Now, obviously, there's going to be loads of different musical contexts that I haven't really explored where you can use these MIDI controllers, such as, I don't know, triggering samples with the BU16. However, there's also lots of non-musical ways in which these can be really handy. For example, I am an occasional, perhaps terrible DJ, and when I go to these different clubs, often the lighting rigs are controlled by a computer with an attached MIDI controller, and I have to say that often these clubs don't necessarily have particularly good MIDI controllers, or they're broken, or they've gone missing, and so rather than, you know, facing the shame of having to click through the different colours of the lights with a mouse, I've started to take in these grids along with me, because I can quickly plug them in, set them up to control the lighting, colours and the scenes and everything else. Another way that I've found use with these, and in particular the PO16, which is the potentiometer version of the grids, is to use as a controller for Lightroom. Now, if you've ever spent a whole day editing wedding photos, then you'll probably sympathise, or at least empathise with the idea that you quickly get bored of having to click through all the different elements within Lightroom. And there is a solution. There's a bit of open source software called MIDI to LR, and that allows you to map any kind of MIDI controller parameters onto the different functions within Lightroom, so you can sit back, put something on the telly, put your feet up, and just twiddle the knobs of the MIDI controller to your heart's content and process the photos in a much quicker and more enjoyable fashion. So that's the grid system from Intech Studio. They seem like a really interesting, creative young company, and you get that idea even just looking through their website, so I'm sure they've got lots more interesting things to come. And if you're in the market for a highly portable, highly customizable MIDI controller, then I would definitely recommend taking a look at these, because they are actually pretty good. Thanks to Intech for sending me them out. That is the video over. Goodbye.